Hi and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm going to talk about the basics of lawmaking from a legal perspective. So much more just about why do we regulate in general, how does it reflect on society, and this lawmaking process, what is lawmaking? So before we can go into the actual making the law, so how do we do it? Let's ask ourselves the question, why do we regulate? In our part of the world, in our countries within the EU, we have based our society on democracy. The idea of that the majority of the population must be right. They must represent the consensus of our society. So when we have a constitution, our constitution is not just a legal paper, it's a contract. It's a societal contract where we all agree on the baseline, on our basic principles, and how we want to structure the future of our society. In our constitutions, we will see some general principles. We will see principles of protection of property rights, freedom of expression, and a lot more examples. These are general principles that we worship and that we all agree upon is necessary for our society. It might differ across the world, even across the EU. There might be differences in the constitutional foundations. But our constitution and our general principles, well, they represent not just the law, they present our legal beliefs, our belief system of what is right and what is wrong. So the law is a tool. It's a tool to write down our social contract with each other, within our nation, and even within our union, as in the European Union. So the law, the reason why we regulate, well, it's because we want to acknowledge, highlight, and share our belief system, our social contract with each other. Some of our principles are also to protect, for example, the welfare state, secure safety of inhabitants of our population, and just to safeguard the society as we see society as a whole. So there might be differences in constitutions, in different legal regimes within the EU and across the world. We have to know, and we have to understand that these issues or differences, they reflect the general perception in the country or in the union, in the region, in the area. So we regulate to make sure that everyone follows our own constructed social contract. When do we regulate? This can differ greatly among nations. I put out here just the old dispute between common law and civil law, because civil law countries will typically have a vast more detailed regulation, hence also regulate more often than common law countries. So that was just to put it out here. But when do we regulate? Well, we regulate because we want to acknowledge the social contract. So when do we regulate? We do that when the balance is tipping off our aim or our protection. So we have some core issues, some core principles in our society that we want to safeguard. If reality is moving away from this, that is when we tend to regulate, because when we have to kick it back on track and stop the movement to make sure that reality, society, people, our social contract will still be in line with our core belief system, which is our constitutional rights and our general legal principles. So we regulate, it's not typically, you can't time it saying on Tuesday when we need to regulate, we regulate. We regulate when we see a necessity to safeguard society, safeguard people, industries, and to keep our society on track. For example, after experiencing a financial crisis, well, we did see a lot of regulation within the financial sector because we wanted to avoid one of these crises one more time, or at least try to avoid a future financial crisis based on the same objectives and the same key elements that drove to the past financial crisis. So we see regulation as a reaction. It's a reaction to society, it's a reaction to reality, and that is also sometimes the fault, because sometimes proactive regulation could also be a way going forward. But when we do see proactive regulation, especially, for example, within the climate and the whole green transitioning, we want to be proactive, even that it might be too late. But it can be hard because people tend not to care that much. Hence, the regulation typically is a bit more soft law based than hard law based. Hard law is much easier to use when we have a direct effect. We have an externality problem. We have something in society that is tipping off. Then it's easy to just like stop it with hard law instead of coming up with some general principles that we typically would see that when we tend to have more a proactive approach. This brings us to the last question on how do we regulate. Of course, there are a very different tradition depending on which member state, which nationality, etc., and also at which level. So member state will regulate more detailed typically than at the EU. This is not because member states are typically better at assigning regulation. It tends more to be back to why, because if we look at the EU regulation, we have to see that the legal belief system, that the social contract that we use EU law to kind of frame, has to be so broad that it can take the belief system, the legal belief system of multiple member states. That is typically why we see EU regulation be a bit more political, a bit more broad, not that detailed. Where we see at member state level, it's much easier to interpret, and we have a better sense of the legal belief system and where we can go from here. Then we have different types of regulation, and I will not go much into this, but just like, so how do we really do this? Well, we have a process, and then we have the toolbox. The toolbox, that could be like a minimum or a maximum requirement. So your minimum directive, for example, the member states must at least do this effort, or private entities, and maximum is of course a limitation on it. Then there's a whole dispute about directive versus regulation, the direct effect. Should the member state, would they be the ones best suited for implementing EU law? Well, then we use directives, and it can be very detailed, where regulation will typically be more broad, but then it has direct effect. But it also, we can only use regulation when we have analyzed that this area needs to be regulated at a union level, regional level, rather than member state level. So there's like difference in how do we regulate depending on member state versus the EU, and in the rest of the world it might be a federation or something, or union. So we still have that differentiation. And then we have the toolbox. So what do we have in the toolbox? We have different kind of elements at how we regulate, using different tools to obtain what we want. And the last thing is the process. So we need to have a timeline. We need a deadline that is not when we want to implement new laws, we cannot do it overnight. We need a timeline so everyone, corporation, private persons, everyone can kind of adapt to, okay, so this is where we're going from here. So because remember, go back again. So we react typically with regulation on something that we see in society, which means that we kind of want to counter a behavior. So when we do that, we cannot say it's overnight, this is illegal. We need an implementation period for everyone to adapt and kind of get back on track on something that we think is in line with the structure of our society, our core beliefs, and our general principles. This is why we have a transposition period. A last element I put up here was the impact assessment, because in EU we have a core principle of proportionality, and therefore when we have these major regulatory interference in markets or etc., we make sure that we regulate in the right manner. So we should not use regulation instead of a minimum directive if the minimum directive could solve the problem. Because using EU regulation, well, that has a larger impact. So we always need to make the proportionate regulatory interference or just legislative kind of process. We need to use that tool which is most applicable and has the least extra consequences, the one that makes the least externalities or side effects to society. So this is why we make an impact assessment, to make sure that we are on point. So this was just a reflection just of some of the total basics things within lawmaking. And the reason why I brought this up is because if we want to comply with regulation, we need to understand why we regulate. We need to understand when, and we need to understand how. Because otherwise, what are we complying to? So compliance is not just upholding the law. Compliance is about understanding the legal discipline, understanding why we regulate. Because then we get the aim of the law, we get the aim of regulator. And if we comply to that, well, then we're already kind of complying to future regulation. Because if we align our business to the core principles of example giving EU law, well, then we will always be compliant in the future, instead of just complying with the articles or the concrete text in the regulation. So learning what lawmaking is makes it easier to comply with future regulation. So this was a video on just lawmaking in general. Stay tuned and subscribe to this channel, and let's talk much more about compliance.